52 years ago, I pulled into Fort Myers in the back of a Rambler station wagon. My mother was driving, my younger brother was beside me, and my dog was in the back seat. We came here to join my father who had preceded us. It was on a Sunday. I'll never forget that because my favorite team was the Baltimore Colts, and the only Super Bowl they ever won, I was in the back of a Rambler. Never got to see it. But the following Sunday, we became a part of this congregation. In the past 52 years, I have seen a lot. And this congregation has seen a lot of me. I was baptized here. I graduated high school here. I got married in this congregation. My wife and I had 3 sons who each were baptized in this congregation. In 1989, I was given a very rare privilege to serve as a minister in the congregation I had grown up in. I did that part-time for 3 years and then full-time for the past 31. And I guess I've seen just about everything there is to see. From y'all supporting me when I nearly died of cancer, to being sent on a mission trip to the Ukraine, to chaperoning youth trips, to teaching toddlers and everything in between. It's hard to walk in this building and not go into a room or touch a piece of furniture or turn a doorknob without many memories flooding in. And I wouldn't be honest if I didn't say that today comes for me the time of great sadness. But I don't want today to be sad. I think that the change in my circumstances as we come to a time when our paths diverge give both of us tremendous opportunities to grow in God. And my prayer is that each of us will be granted by God the strength and the wisdom to meet those new challenges. Now, I need to start off today by thanking several people, particularly the staff that I've worked with all these years. I want to thank, first of all, Randy Simmons. Randy took a chance on me to be a staff member here when my biggest qualifications were probably eagerness and enthusiasm. And I appreciate that very much. That'll always mean a lot to me. It changed the course of my life. And just an aside tip, if you ever find that you're going to be preaching somewhere for a living, to listen to one of the very best for nearly 40 years is a good idea. And then there's Sean McAfee. I think that I can say without fear of contradiction that of all the youth ministers we've ever had, Sean McAfee is the shortest. But despite his shortcomings, Sean has become truly a great friend to me, and I have appreciated doing vacation Bible schools with him for nearly 2 decades. And I've had the opportunity to be a superhero and a cowboy and an astronaut and a castaway and an Olympian and a Lego master and I don't know what all, and those are great memories. I'm going to miss that. And then there's Tim Jacobson. Now, you think of Tim as a talented song leader, and perhaps some of you know he's our tech guru. But what I'll always remember about Tim Jacobson is his deep compassion. About 15 years ago, I emailed Tim and said, "Listen, I'm having trouble attaching pictures to my emails." And he sent back an email that said, "Steve, that's okay. A lot of men your age have that attachment disorder." I think the people I'm going to miss most of all are the church secretaries I've worked with. Ladies who have, without exception, filled the role with grace and good humor, starting with Frida Black and Betty Tharp when I began, to Georgette Gibney and Marietta Crimmins and Carrie Green, my dear daughter-in-law Yvonne Caldwell, Lindsay Hutchings up to Tasha Delisle. They have made coming to work a great deal of fun. And probably the thing that I immediately am going to miss being in my office in LaBelle by myself is I'm not going to have anybody to tease. And I just know the temptation is going to come over me to call up the office here and ask them if the refrigerator's running. I've got to find something to do like that. And I think about the custodians that I've worked with, the irascible Bill Mahoney, bless his heart. He did a great many good things here and certainly made my job easier. And now Joe Battle, who takes things in stride, which is a quality I wish I had more of. Secondly, I want to thank the elders here. For over 30 years, they have managed me with a light touch and given me a great deal of freedom. I truly appreciate that. And the last 3 months of transitioning over there to LaBelle has been a time of great blessing for me and my family. And lastly, I want to thank the congregation here. Whether you're a deacon or a ministry leader or just a member I love, some of you I've known for decades and some I've known for months, but in either situation, I hope that I've had some small part in blessing your life, because you certainly have blessed mine in great measure. Now, nobody tells you how to do a farewell sermon. And I certainly don't want to sound like I'm preaching my own funeral. So, and the funny thing about coincidences like today is that Braxton gets up and reads a passage that we read at every funeral we ever do. And Randy teaches on the prophet Amos during Bible class and ends with a slide that says in letters 3 feet tall, "Shut up, get out." Okay. About 10 years ago, it was decided that Sean McAfee would fill in for Randy whenever he was unavailable. But Randy and the elders both told me, now you have a backup sermon just in case, we're both out of pocket. And it's probably a testimony to both those good men that never happened. So when I was cleaning out my files, I ran across this sermon and blew the dust off of it and said, I ought to give them the sermon they never got to hear. Because it's a good sermon to leave a legacy, I think, behind. It's a good message. And I changed some things and tweaked some things and robbed some things maybe I'd done 20 years ago. But it goes a little bit like this. About 20 years ago, my younger brother, the one I was in the Rambler with, had moved to Grand Rapids, Michigan, and he said, "Steve, come on up and visit," and I brought the family up there, and he said, "I tell you what, let's you and I go up to this amusement park north of town called Michigan's Adventure." Okay. I've never been there. He said, it'd be a lot of fun. And so we came into the park, and he said, "Come on, let's choose a ride to go on." I'm not big on rides. That internal ear thing, I get dizzy and sick, and it's not pretty. And so we walked by the Drummer Boy and the Tilt-A-Whirl and the Scrambler, and I said, "No, I'm not going to do that." We came by the roller coaster, which is called Shivering Timbers. I found out later it's the 4th largest wooden roller coaster in the entire world. I said, not a way in the world am I getting on that thing. And we came around the corner, and here was the Sea Dragon. Now, of all the rides I had seen, how bad could this be? It's just a swing. Now, I guess, unfortunately, we walked up to the ride right as it was ending. And so we got on there, and my brother, with his usual wicked smile, said, "Let's go sit up near where the dragon's head is." I said, "Okay." So we went up there, and I should have been tipped off when the guy came along and said, "Now everybody's got your seatbelts on tight, right?" It's like, wait a minute, this is just a swing. What's the big deal? And then the ride started, and we got a little bit more vertical. In fact, we got upside down. And what made it even worse was the little girl beside me screaming in my ear the whole time like she was going to die. And I just kind of blacked out and prayed to God, please get me off this ride. And as we walked away, I said, Daniel, that ride was horrible, but that girl screaming in my ear just drove me over the edge. And he said, there wasn't any girl, bro, that was you. And I said, I hate that thing. And he said, well, don't be so quick to judge, because I think it would be a great evangelistic tool. I said, what in the world are you talking about? He said, well, the Apostle Paul could have dragged that ride into any town he came to and put people on it, and it wouldn't take long before they're screaming, Jesus, save us. Take them down and baptize them and move on to the next town. Now, a lot of things my brother says are dumb, and so I didn't think much about it until I'm on my way home from Michigan. And it occurred to me that what he meant in jest was often how a lot of preaching has been. About 300 years ago, in what historians call the first Great Awakening here in America, preaching was hellfire and brimstone. One of the notable preachers, Jonathan Edwards, had his favorite sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And if you had listened to one of his 3-hour sermons, he would have described in lurid detail just how you were going to burn and be eaten by worms, and it would start all over again and last forever. And people did respond. Man, they came by the thousands based on messages like that. And it worked for a while, but people get tired of being motivated by fear. And a lot of times people come up with other choices in that kind of environment. They begin to think, well, okay, how close to the line can I get before I have to be in danger of those terrible flames? Or other people just throw up their hands and say, I can't possibly live a good enough life. I better party while I can, and because it's going to burn later. But certainly in the last 75 years, certainly in my lifetime, a rediscovery of the lessons in the New Testament have shown that the metaphor that's used over and over again are not that we're slaves and serving in fear of an angry God, but that instead we're children serving out of love. And so most of the sermons I have heard in my lifetime have been about how God loves me. But if we're not careful, we can go to the other extreme, and sermons can be little more than what we tell preschoolers, I love you and you love me and we're a wonderful, happy family. And that's not exactly what God is saying either. And so this morning I want to look at what is the love God expects. And I think one of the best people to look to that for is the apostle whom Jesus loved, who wrote a letter we call 1 John. Anytime I think my heart's going to stop, I'm going to take a drink. All right. And in it today, I've pulled out 4 lessons that John talks about in his letter. The first one is this: God expects us to care about each other. My very favorite verses in the Bible, 1 John 4, verses 20 and 21. Anyone who says he loves God, but in fact hates his brother or sister, is a liar. He who doesn't love his brother or sister whom he has seen can't love God whom he has not seen. Here is the command God has given us. Anyone who loves God must also love his brothers and sisters. Now, the world is big on brotherly love, not so much God, but the idea of a common humanity. That's been true throughout my lifetime. For those of you old enough to remember songs like I'd Like to Teach the World to Sing or We Are the World, there's always this emphasis on a worldwide brotherhood. And that not just in the Western world, but also in the former Soviet Union. And my illustration today on this point, I know is kind of out there, kind of unusual, but I think it shows the point in the sad lesson of Major Gennady Osipovich. Gennady was a loving father. He would go to his daughter's elementary school every year during International Brotherhood Day. And even though his idea of brotherhood in the Soviet Union might be a lot different than what my idea of brotherhood was, still, it was a point of emphasis for him. And they could count on him every year going in and giving his lecture to the children on how all men are brothers. In fact, he'd come in sometimes when it wasn't International Brotherhood Day and give that same thing. It was almost a little bit of a joke at the school. Call Gennady, he'll do the brotherhood thing. But the other thing about Gennady is that he was a pilot for the Soviet Air Force. He was a very good pilot. In fact, they say he was one of the best in the Far East. He served on that little red place way out there, not far off the coast, called Sakhalin Island. And he was a devoted patriot of Mother Russia. And he flew that Sukhoi Su-15 jet, he and others in his squadron, most days a week. Now, what people didn't know at the time, probably, at least outside of the squadron, was that the amount of fuel that you got in your jet was dependent on how loyal they thought you were. Because when you were out on that island, they didn't want to give you enough fuel to hop over to Japan and defect with your jet. But Gennady, nobody worried about. They gave him the most gasoline in the whole squadron. And they spent their whole time playing cat and mouse with the American Air Force. The Americans would use a variety of planes, and in this case, most often a Boeing 707 that had been outfitted with various electronic devices. And they would send these planes right up to the border just to see the Soviets turn on their radar or their missile defenses or what planes came up. You get kind of a good idea of how people will react if you kind of set them off like that. But it was a game. You only went up to the border, you went no further, and the Russians did the same thing in Alaska. And so it was kind of a cat and mouse kind of game that everybody had settled into. Until one night in September of 1983, Gennady's squadron got a call which was unusual, first of all, because it was at night. The spy planes would go in the daytime because they could take pictures way out in the distance as they went along the border. Not as much to do at night. It's probably different now with all the electronics and things. But in the early 80s, these planes didn't come at night, and Gennady was puzzled when his squadron got the call to say there was a plane that had not only come toward the border, it had crossed into it. It wasn't playing the game right. And Gennady and his squadron went up after this plane, and they turned on the afterburners to catch up, and of course, one by one, his fellow squadron mates had to drop out because they didn't have enough fuel. Until Gennady was the only one left. And he got behind this plane, and he could tell it not only was weird because it wasn't playing the game right, it had crossed the border at night, it had all its lights on like it was Christmas. This was just strange to him. What was going on? And the ground controller said, well, listen, shoot bullets across the front of the plane to get its attention. But what people didn't think about, and people in the West didn't know at the time, was how poor off the Soviet Union was economically. They could not afford to put tracer bullets in their airplanes. And so in pitch black dark, you shoot bullets across the front of a plane at high speed, nobody sees those. He could have shot all night, they wouldn't have noticed. And so he had a choice. It's just him and that plane. And he could tell it wasn't like any of the other planes he had gone up against. This was different. In fact, this might be a passenger plane. No, it's got to be an American trick. And he went back and forth in his mind on that. And if this had occurred, if a Russian jet, a Russian passenger liner, had flown into Alaska or over Seattle or over Paris or London, one would think that no matter what happened, the pilots that were sent up to intercept it, first of all, it would be a whole squadron of them, and secondly, they would get in front of that plane and force it down to an airfield. But Almoner Brothers Gennady, when he was told to bring it down, he decided the best way to do that was to shoot 2 missiles from under his wings. One hit the back of the plane, one hit the wing, and Gennady says he saw this plane spin into the ocean at 600 miles an hour, and there was very little left. Gennady had killed 269 people. Not from hate. He didn't hate anybody on that plane. He just didn't care enough to do the extra effort it took to do what was right. All men are brothers is a great thing to say in a second grade classroom. It's hard to say that as nothing but tennis shoes float up on the coast of Japan. The test of true love is not just the absence of hate. I don't think anybody here hates anybody else here. I don't think so. If you do, raise your hand. Okay, I don't think anybody here hates anybody else. But that's only half the equation. Do you love your brothers and sisters? Because love is an action verb. Real brotherhood begins with real caring. It's real easy to think that the Christian race is what happens once the closing prayer is said and you get to your car real fast and beat the Baptist to Red Lobster. That's not what the Christian race is. The writer of Hebrews says, don't neglect meeting together as the habit of some is. But the big important part of that verse is not just the don't stop meeting together, it's what you're here to do. You can pray at home. You can sing at home, you can listen to Randy at home, and you can mail in your offering. I'm not encouraging you to do that. I'm just saying that's what you could do. But being here accomplishes 2 things. Jesus said that He is in our midst when we're gathered together, but also, and just as important, it gives you the opportunity to encourage another person. You say you attend church regularly, I'm happy for that. That's a good thing. But it's about more than attendance. It's about the active interaction of a family. And caring can be small expressions. One of the things I like to do is to go to Dollar Tree and buy a box of various kinds of cards and mail cards out. And I can hear young people going, yeah, that is weird, boomer. Nobody uses the mail and puts stamps and send that out. So for people my age and older, this is a good alternative. You can go buy cards cheaply and send them out, and people will appreciate it. For you younger people, hit somebody up on the phone. Offer a smile. Do Facebook, or maybe other kinds of social media my generation I'm just too old to know about. You can shake someone's hand, or at least in the era of COVID, a fist bump or an elbow bump or something. Text somebody, email them, or give them a hug. Because everybody needs to feel cared about and encouraged. Look for times to show that you care. And that can be in your bulletin that you pick up and the prayer concerns that are listed there. They also have a list of all the birthdays coming up that you could contact someone. Hopefully they'll continue to do the emails that I send out after I'm gone. I appreciate so much Diane Simmons and Cynthia Jeffcott starting the Help Ministry, helping, encouraging, and loving people. For a 3-month commitment, you'll be given, like H through L in the directory, and you just encourage those people. That's a good thing. The worship service prayer screen, the Widows Ministry, going to see someone who's homebound or visiting someone in the hospital, or if the going to the hospital gives you the heebie-jeebies, call them at the hospital. Be a part of a small group. Have your home open for hospitality. Look, I know your home is messy. Everybody's home is messy. Have somebody over to your house. Don't be afraid. And those purple cards that we have in the pew there in front of you, you know what those are for? Those are encouragement cards. Anytime it just hits you to do, reach out and fill one of those out and put it in the offering box in the back. and those wonderful secretaries will mail it for you. So all you've got to do is reach out and grab a pencil and write something down. We need to be sure that we care about each other. Because I know what your reaction is. I can't care about all these people. No, you can't. But if everybody cares about somebody, then we won't have anybody feel like a nobody. You know what the secret is to a large congregation? The secret to a large congregation, it's really just a bunch of small congregations that meet together. And what's important is that you find your congregation inside this church and you love them. And you don't let your congregation inside the congregation become fixed so it's a clique and nobody else can get in. Leave it open. Leave the door open for other people. It's important that you have a group of people that you care about and care about you. You say you love God, that's great. Then God expects us to show we care about each other. Secondly, later or earlier in the book of 1 John, the apostle writes, if anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. God expects us to help each other. Let me tell you about the Madison County miracle. In July of 1995, in Madison County, Ohio, which is a little ways southwest of Columbus, a rural county where, as you might expect, a lot of the teenagers join things like Future Farmers of America. They raise animals and they have a show where they are auctioned off, and the money goes, I don't know if it goes to FFA or to the family, but it's just a modest amount, and it teaches you to raise an animal. And this particular year, there was a young lady, lovely young lady named Katie Fisher. Unfortunately, Katie was stricken with something called Burkitt's lymphoma, which is fairly rare, and in that day and time was almost universally fatal because it's fast growing. And she was sick. She was in and out of the hospital all the time. She didn't look like that by the time of July 1995 came around and the great FFA auction. But the people in the town, they wanted to do something to help her family, particularly with the mounting hospital bills. So when the auction came around, the auctioneer, whose name was Roger Fisher, not her daddy, I don't know if it's some relation or just coincidental, he hoped that he could get more than the $2 a pound average that these animals would sell for. And that's where the first miracle came in. Because by the time the bidding was over, that little lamb had garnered a new record, $11.60 a pound. But see, that's where the second miracle happened. The man who bought the lamb picked it up, set it back down, and told the auctioneer, sell it again. And every time they bid and sold that lamb, the next person would pick it up and set it down and say, sell it again. That day, they sold that lamb 36 times, raised over $16,000. And if you go on the internet today, the Katie Fisher Memorial Scholarship Fund for FFA is still going strong. And they'll do it to raise money through golf outings or different events, and they still try to give a scholarship to 3 or 4 kids every year to honor Katie's memory. Because it wasn't enough just to express how sad they were at what Katie was dealing with and her family. They needed to do something to show that they loved her. Jesus' younger brother James writes these words, "What good is it, dear brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but don't show it by your actions? Can that kind of faith save anyone? Suppose you see a brother or sister who has no food or clothing, and you say, 'Goodbye, have a good day, stay warm and eat well,' and then you don't give that person any food or clothing. What good does that do?" So you see, faith by itself isn't enough. Unless it produces good deeds, it is dead and useless. We need to avoid 2 excuses when it comes to helping other people. If you were to go to my dad's house right now and he had his leg cut off, sitting in the living room, and ask him how he was, what's he going to say? I'm fine. That's the way we were raised, the Southern people, maybe the way you were raised. And we have to be willing to accept help like that. And we have to understand that everybody's not fine. And that it's not okay just to let it go. And the second excuse is that I'll help when I can afford to. That's like having a baby. You'll never be able to afford it. You've just got to decide to. Well, Steve, I can't help everybody. No, you can't help everybody. But do you ever help anybody is the question. Everybody needs help sometime, and it's not always financial. Sometimes people just need a listening ear, or sometimes they need help with child care or mowing the yard or cleaning the house. We need to be willing to accept it. You shouldn't be the kind of person who you'd rather die than accept help. Okay, I've seen people do that, and they've died, but nobody has had the opportunity to bless them or grow in any way because of it. And we need to be willing to give it. You say you love God, that's great. Then God expects us to help each other. Thirdly, God expects us not to love the world. Again, in the book of 1 John, he writes, if anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life comes not from the Father, but from the world. My father had a friend, and his friend predated me. He had had this friend long before I came along. And my earliest memories are of his friend coming by the house most every night. He was a wonderful storyteller. Boy, he had stories on everything. Strong opinions sometimes on everything from politics to religion to women to sports. And he became a good friend to me. He was an endless source of knowledge. He drew great pictures. He took my dad and I to our first football game, and he was often my main babysitter. He took me to my first concert. It was because of my father's friend that I got to see the launch of Apollo 11. And I grieved with him when Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King were shot in the same year. And through my father's friend, I had the great privilege to meet Andy Griffith. But my father's friend changed over the years. He had another side that got worse as he grew older. He started swearing more and more, and he talked a lot about sex, premarital, adultery, homosexuality, polygamy, deviance. And he became more and more violent, and we weren't sure what to do with our changed friend and came close to ending our friendship more than a few times. But even today, he still comes by Dad's house. What was his name? I never knew. I only knew him by his initials. The influence of the world is an age-old problem. All the way back at the beginning of Christianity, by the time of the 4th century, this Christian teacher named Lactantius noticed what he writes. The subjects of comedies are the loves of prostitutes, the tragedies parade before the eyes, the murder of parents. Is the art of the mimes any better? They teach adultery by acting it out. How do we expect our young people to respond when they see that these things are practiced without shame and that everyone eagerly watches? 1,800 years don't change a lot. How do we choose our friends? As long as it's PG-13, it's okay to watch with our kids. As long as they sell it at the grocery store, it's okay to read. As long as it comes through the car radio, it's okay to listen to. As long as it's not one of those pay cable channels, it's okay to see. As long as it's popular, it's okay to attend. Don't turn your moral keys over to these different groups. You've got to drive your own moral car. because the unfiltered world can have a corrosive effect on Christians, especially our children. Your car could end up like that car if you're not careful. You say you love God, that's great. Then God expects you not to love the world. And lastly, God expects us to follow His directions. John writes, "We know that we have come to know Him if we keep His commands. Whoever says, 'I know Him,' but does not do what He commands is a liar, and the truth is not in that person. But if anyone obeys His word, love for God is truly made complete in them." Reuben Brown was a good man. He grew up in Mississippi, and he moved to Chicago, to the South Side, where people like him, a black American, often moved. And he was disturbed because so many of the places that people lived in there were infested with rats and with roaches, and he wanted to do something to help them out. People ought not have to live like this, because Reuben Brown was a good man. He remembered that back in Mississippi, they spread what he called the Mississippi stuff all over the fields, and they didn't have any problem with rats and roaches. They lived a good life compared to what folks in Chicago did. And so he drove down to Mississippi, and he got a few barrels of the Mississippi stuff, and he advertised in the local shopper, and he would sell it by pouring it in an unmarked mason jar. And he did this for 6 years, and it worked. Reuben Brown was a good man. He helped the people on the south side of Chicago kill more rats and roaches than they had ever done in several decades previous. But Reuben Brown hadn't read the directions. The Mississippi stuff was methylparathion, and the reason it was spread outside in the fields in Mississippi was because it was designed for sunlight to break it down, so that it was only deadly for a while. But if you put it in a room, in a closet, indoors, it's deadly forever and causes birth defects and neurological problems and all sorts of horrible health ills. The Environmental Protection Agency finally found out about what poor Reuben had done, and it was one of the biggest cleanups in U.S. history. They had to go into 1,000 homes, over 1,000 homes in Chicago, homes and businesses that were contaminated because they had just poured the Mississippi stuff everywhere. It took $20 million, and this was in the 90s, so I mean, serious money, $20 million to clean up this mess. And they had to tear out furniture and carpeting and drywall, and outside of town they had to dig a big hole and line it special and dumped all this contaminated stuff in that hole. Reuben Brown was a good man, but he was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison basically because he had not read the directions. Jesus says in the book of Matthew, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven." Reading the directions means seeking out what He said. It's not enough to just own a Bible and it sits beside you like an airwick. You've got to open it up and see what it says. And then you have to obey what it says. The fact that you may be a good man is not a substitute for reading the directions. You say you love God, that's great. Then God expects you to follow His directions. And so this morning we really have two choices. You can say that you love God, but live as if we define what love means, pretty sure that He won't care. Or we say we love God in His way, on His terms, knowing that He cares a great deal. The love God expects is for us to care about each other, to help each other, to not love the world, and to follow His directions. And that's my message to you today, and hopefully the legacy that I leave with you going forward. If you're ever out in LaBelle, I invite you to stop by. This is the advertisement portion of the message. Currently, we're called the Central Church of Christ, and we meet at 10 a.m. But I'm got no better sense than to change everything, and we're going to be called the LaBelle Church of Christ. And beginning in August, we're going to restart Bible classes and meet for Bible study at 9:30 and worship at 10:30. So depending on when you come out there to visit, be sure you get the time right. And then finally, I want to leave you with something I ran across. It's been over 20 years ago. It was my responsibility to preach in Estero, those of you that remember when we had a second campus. And I had to preach the last sermon there and close the place down before we sold both campuses and built this place. And I ran across something that I think has meaning today and brings me great comfort. Those who love God never meet for the last time. Whether it's in this life or the next, we'll see each other again. And I wish you all well. And if today I've touched a chord and you find that you have some spiritual need on your journey, we invite you to come forward now as we stand and sing.